The order that silenced the room. You're not here to inspire anyone? Strip the damn medal and follow the rules. That was the moment the room died. The words didn't echo. They struck blunt, cold, and loud enough to silence 50 hearts mid-beat. And then came the push. A federal courthouse security officer, barely 30, shoved the old man back by his shoulder, not violently but just enough to make it clear who had power and who didn't. The old man didn't stumble. He didn't even blink. He straightened his spine. The Medal of Honor on his chest caught the light like it had been waiting for this exact moment. Colton Rourke was 66, retired colonel, former Medivac commander. Marja Helman Sangin names stitched into the lining of his soul more than any jacket. He wasn't there for glory. He was there to speak for a girl. Private Eleanor Dawson, 24, who had refused to carry out an order in Helmand province, an order that would have seen civilians dragged into a crossfire. Now she was being prosecuted for failure to follow command under combat protocols. No one else from her unit would testify. No one but him. He stepped into the witness box, slowly, deliberately. In his worn khakis and a pressed white shirt, tucked just enough to show he still understood order. No uniform. But the medal he wore like skin. Judge Vivian Rowe, seated on the bench in a tailored navy suit, sharp bob cut and heels that never tapped twice, didn't wait a beat. Her voice cut through the room like frost through glass. This court does not permit symbolic displays that may prejudice the jury, she said, eyes locked on the medal. Colton didn't respond. Colonel Rourke, she said this time with that steely inflection that made clerks shudder. Remove the medal. Now. Gasps. Some tried to hide it. Others didn't. Eleanor's mother, seated 2 rows behind the prosecution, whispered something inaudible, her hands clenched in her lap. A Marine veteran in the back shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Even the lead prosecutor looked away. Colton didn't move. His right hand slowly rose just enough to brush his fingers against the edge of the medal. Then he looked at her. Not with defiance, not even anger. Just the kind of stillness that made you feel the gravity of every name engraved on a headstone he had stood beside. I'm not here to inspire, he said. I'm here to remind you someone bled for your right to judge. The silence that followed was unbearable. A reporter's pen scratched too loudly. A cough echoed like a crack. Vivian Rowe didn't flinch. You're in contempt of court, Colonel, she said, and banged her gavel. But the room wasn't with her anymore. You could feel it, the weight had shifted. The narrative no longer belonged to her. Then the phone started vibrating. A bailiff leaned down to whisper something in the judge's ear, and for the first time her lips tightened. Her eyes darted to the door. Colton stepped down every step precise, as if marching through enemy terrain again. His hands didn't shake, not even when he opened the door to leave and saw the hallway outside filled with press. Let me ask you this. What would you have done if you were him? Would you have removed it to keep your seat to speak your truth? Or would you have stood silent and let the medal speak louder than any words ever could if this story already has you gripping your chair? I want you to comment below. With one word, honor. Because what happens next, no one in that courtroom could have predicted. And if you've ever known a veteran who carried more in silence than most people say in a lifetime, share this with someone who needs to understand that kind of strength. Outside the courthouse, 2 black Suburbans with Pentagon plates rolled up. The air shifted. Something was coming. And inside the story wasn't just about a young Marine anymore. It was about what we choose to protect, about who we allow to be forgotten. 2 minutes later, everything was about to change. A medal meant for the dead. You wore that medal like a badge of pride. I see it as manipulation. The words came from behind the cameras off mic, but clear as a sniper shot. And they didn't come from a journalist. They came from Texas Attorney General Raymond Shaw. Clean suit, white teeth, and the kind of arrogance that made silence feel like surrender. His voice carried across the marble hallway of the Dallas Federal Courthouse like he owned the building. Maybe he did. Colton Rourke didn't respond. He didn't even blink. He stood quietly near the rotunda, surrounded by press, his Medal of Honor still resting against his chest like an immovable truth. A truth Shaw wanted erased. By now, the clip of Colton refusing to remove the medal had been viewed over 3.2 million times. It had been less than 1 hour. Twitter was ablaze. Facebook groups with names like Vietnam Vets for Truth and Brothers of Helmand were posting Colton's image with captions like, "That medal isn't metal. It's memory." Inside the courthouse lobby, Elena Dawson stood beside her public defender, shaking slightly. She didn't know where to look, the floor, the cameras, or Colton. He stepped toward her slowly. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this for me?" Colton paused, his voice low but sure. "Because if I didn't, this medal would mean nothing." Elena blinked. "You didn't even know me." "I knew your brother," Colton said. "I carried him out of a wrecked LZ. We thought he'd make it." Her face dropped. She hadn't known that. "I was the last one who spoke to him," Colton said. "He told me to tell you to stop following orders that break you." That was the moment everything changed for her, but not for Shaw. He stepped up beside the cameras and raised his voice for the press to hear. "Let's be clear. What you witnessed earlier was not bravery, it was a stunt. That man wore a weaponized memory to manipulate a jury and undermine military protocol." Reporters froze. A few even lowered their cameras. This wasn't strategy. This was theater. Colton looked at him, calm, steady. Then he did something no one expected. He took a step forward, placed his hand gently over the medal, and said, "Then prosecute me. Strip me of this. Call it a crime if it makes you feel powerful." The room gasped. Elena's mother, watching from behind, dropped into a chair. Even a junior staffer from Shaw's office whispered, "Sir, maybe we should." But Shaw didn't flinch. "Don't tempt me, Colonel. I have the authority." Colton replied, "You might have authority, but you don't have honor." Boom! Someone clapped. Just one. A man in civilian clothes, clearly a veteran, near the hallway column. Security told him to quiet down, but it was too late. The tone of the room had shifted again. And this is where you come in. If you believe some medals are not worn for glory but for ghosts, then leave a comment below with the word ghosts. It means you stand for remembrance, not regulation. Now brace yourself, because just as the argument was hitting a wall, something unexpected broke through it. 4 black SUVs rolled to a stop in front of the courthouse. No sirens, no shouting. But you felt the air change. The seal of the United States Department of Defense was emblazoned on the side, and stepping out from the lead vehicle was Major General Marianne Holston. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't ask for clearance. She simply marched into the courthouse, flanked by 2 Pentagon legal advisors, her uniform crisp, her face unreadable. Everyone parted like the sea. Shaw looked at her, and for the first time that morning his mouth closed. "General Holston," someone whispered. "What's she doing here?" Colton didn't say a word, but his eyes, those ice-blue eyes, followed her every step. Holston approached the central clerk. "Deliver this to Judge Rowe immediately," she said, handing over a sealed federal order. "What is it?" Shaw asked. She turned to him slowly. "An immediate injunction. Under Department of Defense review. This courtroom is no longer authorized to proceed until further notice." "You can't do that," Shaw barked. "This is a state case." Holston's voice was razor sharp. "This is now a federal matter. We don't allow the public humiliation of a Medal of Honor recipient without oversight." The silence was breathtaking. Even the security guard stood still. In the back, Elena whispered, "Is this really happening?" Colton didn't look at her. He just said, "Not yet," because there was more. Holston stepped up to Colton and saluted him. Full posture, no hesitation. And then she said loud enough for the room to hear, "You should have never had to walk in here alone. If that doesn't deserve a follow, I don't know what does." If you believe this story needs to be heard, subscribe now so you don't miss what happens next. And what happened next? Well, let's just say this. Before Judge Vivian Rowe could even re-enter the courtroom, her authority was already gone. Her gavel would fall silent, and her silence would become the loudest sound in the country for days. Colton looked around. He didn't smile. He didn't break. He just whispered something under his breath, something only Elna could hear. "He told me you'd be stronger than him, and now the entire nation would see if that was true." Because in the next 24 hours, Elna Dawson's name would no longer be a scandal, it would become a symbol. And Colton Rourke. He wouldn't just be a witness, he'd be the one who forced a nation to remember. And the next knock on Judge Rowe's chamber door wouldn't come from a bailiff. It would come from Washington. The general's intervention. "This court is no longer under your authority, Judge Rowe." The words dropped like a gavel wrapped in thunder. General Marianne Holston stood at the center of the courtroom, her shoulders squared, her uniform immaculate, her eyes locked forward. You could feel the air itself retreat. The marble columns seemed to lean away from her as if they too recognized the authority she carried. No one in that room could pretend anymore. Not the prosecutors, not the guards, not even Judge Vivian Rowe. Her world, the courtroom she ruled with icy precision, had just been taken from her by a woman who answered to a power she couldn't control. Holston didn't speak again. She let the silence linger just long enough to sting. Judge Rowe finally entered through the side door, unaware of the federal storm waiting in her chamber. She stopped in her tracks when she saw Holston, then glanced at the sealed order on her bench. Her jaw tightened, her fingers twitched. But she didn't speak. Judge Holston said calmly, "We're not here to challenge your authority. We're here because that authority ended the moment you humiliated a Medal of Honor recipient in front of a jury." Vivian Rowe opened her mouth, but no words came. Her eyes darted to Raymond Shaw, who suddenly looked very small in his $1,000 suit. Holston stepped forward and turned to face the gallery. "This isn't about protocol. This is about principle. And right now, the United States military does not recognize this courtroom as a place of neutral justice." The audience was frozen. Not a cough, not a shuffle, just the thrum of blood in ears and the pounding sense that history was happening right there in front of them. Eleanor sat in the back, her hands shaking in her lap. She wasn't a symbol yet. She was just a soldier who had been made to feel like a criminal. Colton sat beside her, one hand resting lightly on his knee, the other holding his hat. "You still want to tell them?" she whispered. Colton looked at her. "Not yet." Judge Rowe tried to regain control. "This is my courtroom, General. You have no standing here." Holston turned her gaze back to her. "Then you haven't read the document in front of you. As of 0900 hours, this proceeding is under federal injunction. All further actions taken against Colonel Rourke or Private Dawson will be subject to congressional ethics review." The judge's hand hovered above the gavel. She looked around, searching for some ally, some signal that she wasn't alone. But even her clerk had backed away, unsure whether to remain seated or leave the bench entirely. Then came the twist. One of the Pentagon lawyers stepped forward and handed a second envelope to the judge. "Confidential addendum," he said, "for your eyes only." Vivian opened it. Her face drained in stages from pale to gray to something almost transparent. She blinked twice, then stared at Colton. "You knew," she said softly. Colton didn't move. But the truth was now circling her like sharks. "You knew what that order was," she repeated louder this time. "You knew what happened in Helmand." Colton said nothing. Holston turned to the court. "Let me explain, since the judge won't. Colonel Rourke was one of the original signatories on Operation Silent Mercy, a classified initiative designed to protect civilians in red zone engagements. Eleanor Dawson was not disobeying an order. She was upholding the one that actually mattered." A gasp. A woman in the back clutched her husband's arm. A man stood outraged, then sat back down, silenced by the weight of what he'd just heard. Raymond Shaw stepped forward, flustered. "This is outrageous! That order was sealed. No one had clearance." Holston turned to him. "You're right, you didn't. But the colonel did. And now the public will." That's when she walked directly over to Colton and handed him a small device. He pressed a button. The flat screen beside the jury box lit up. Footage. It was grainy black and white from a helmet cam, but it was enough. It showed Eleanor Dawson refusing to fire into a civilian compound, her voice clear. "They're unarmed. I'm not doing it," a superior screamed at her. She didn't move. Then a flash, a strike, and Eleanor dragging a wounded child away from the rubble. The room exploded. People stood. Reporters scrambled. The judge reached for her gavel, then stopped. Colton turned to the room. His voice was low, but it carried like a memory long buried. "Some medals are given, some are earned, but some," he paused, "some are worn, so the world never forgets what you were willing to lose." And in that moment, the cameras captured everything. Holston's quiet respect, Eleanor's tearful silence, Judge Rowe's exposed discomfort, and Shaw cornered not by law but by truth. If you believe the truth should never be buried, type the word "remember" in the comments. Let others know what justice looks like when it's no longer convenient. Because what happens next will define not just one soldier's fate, but the honor of every man and woman who ever served without expecting applause. And as Holston turned to leave, she stopped at the door and said, "Just one more thing. You've done enough damage for one day, Judge. Now let us fix what you tried to erase." Colton stood. And for the first time since stepping into that courthouse, he smiled, just once, because he knew what the next 24 hours would bring, not punishment, but redemption. Restoration. Before the nation, America forgot who he was until a girl he saved reminded them. It started with a photo. Someone had snapped a picture of Colton Rourke as he left the courthouse that afternoon. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't waving, he was just walking forward, eyes down, hat in hand, the Medal of Honor still pinned over his heart. Behind him was Eleanor Dawson, 2 steps back, her hands trembling, but her shoulders lifted higher than they had been in weeks. The photo went viral in less than 3 hours. By sunset, it had been framed on news anchors' desks and printed on the front page of the Washington Post, with one headline, "The Witness Who Refused to Remove His Dead." It was no longer just a case. It was a reckoning. The president was briefed that night. Congressional leaders held private meetings. Veterans organizations issued public statements. And in every corner of America, from VA clinics in Kansas to retired Marine bars in Pennsylvania, old men who'd been forgotten for decades leaned forward in their chairs and whispered, "Someone finally stood up." But not everyone was ready to applaud. Judge Vivian Rowe filed a motion to delay the ethics review, claiming misrepresentation and procedural interference. She appeared on a local news segment, her tone defiant. This was not about disrespecting the military, it was about preserving the integrity of the court. She didn't get the chance to finish her interview, because halfway through a voice interrupted a woman from the audience standing just off camera. She was shaking as she stepped forward. Her name was Maggie Dawson, Eleanor's mother. "You didn't preserve anything," she said. "You watched my daughter get dragged through the dirt for following the very code her brother died defending. And when the one man brave enough to stand for her walked into your courtroom, You tried to humiliate him. That's not integrity, that's cowardice." The clip aired. And for the first time, public opinion shifted completely. Within 48 hours, Judge Rowe was placed on administrative leave. The state bar opened an investigation. Raymond Shaw disappeared from press entirely, his office issuing a single vague statement about reassessing internal protocol. Meanwhile, Eleanor Dawson's court-martial was officially dismissed. Not quietly, but on national television. Standing beside General Holston and Colton Rourke, she was handed a letter from the Department of Defense that began with one sentence: "Private Dawson's refusal to obey an unlawful order is recognized as an act of military conscience." She didn't speak. She couldn't. Her voice cracked halfway through the ceremony. But when Colton took her hand, steadying her, she looked out into the rows of reporters and veterans and said, "I didn't do this alone. My brother died believing in something. Colonel Rourke made sure it wasn't buried." That line would be quoted for years. Colton never wanted to speak in public. But the invitations flooded in. Veterans' halls, congressional hearings, news networks. He refused most. Until one request came from Amarillo, his hometown. They were organizing a welcome home ceremony. Not for him, but for the names he carried. He agreed. When he arrived in Amarillo, something had changed. His old house, the one with the broken fence and faded mailbox, now had flags lining the sidewalk. The word honor was spray-painted in gold across his front gate. Neighbors brought pie. Strangers left handwritten letters. One envelope left without a return address simply said, "You reminded me of my father." The city council declared a day in his name. But Colton asked for something else. He didn't want parades. He asked them to create a memorial wall instead, not for him, for every service member from their county who never made it home. He offered to fund part of it himself using the pension he had never spent. At the unveiling ceremony, Eleanor flew in. So did General Holston. So did the Secretary of Defense. There, in front of hundreds of people, Holston handed Colton a framed letter from the president. It read, "You served with honor. You endured with silence. And when the time came, you stood with the truth. You reminded a nation who we are supposed to be." That moment brought tears. But what came next brought stillness. From the back of the crowd, one man approached the stage. He wore a VA-issued coat, limped slightly, and carried a box. He introduced himself as Anthony Reyes, a retired combat medic. He opened the box and handed Colton a folded American flag. "This belonged to my captain," he said. "He died in my arms. I never knew what to do with it. Until now." Colton took the flag, and for the first time that day he faltered. Just for a second, his hands shook. He didn't speak. He couldn't. But the silence was enough. If you believe honor should be something we live, not just remember, leave a comment with the word stand. Because what Colton did wasn't just brave, it was needed, and the story wasn't over yet. At the edge of the crowd, a young boy pulled at his father's sleeve. "Daddy," he said, pointing at Colton, "was he a real hero?" The father looked down, nodded slowly, and replied, "The quiet kind, the kind that don't ask for medals, just truth." And back in Washington, a committee was forming, one that would review decades of forgotten cases involving veterans dismissed without just cause. They were calling it the Rourke Review. One of the first people they invited to testify, Judge Vivian Rowe. The salute that lasted forever. At 66, he stood again, not to testify, but to be remembered. The statue didn't look like most war memorials. It wasn't a soldier standing tall with a rifle. It wasn't a flag caught mid-wave. It was Colton Rourke, captured in bronze, kneeling, one arm wrapped around a wounded young Marine, shielding her from invisible fire. The Medal of Honor rested quietly on his chest. His face wasn't proud. It wasn't angry. It was tired. It was human. That morning, Fort Hood was silent. Rows of veterans, some in wheelchairs, some standing with canes, some holding photos, lined the field in dress jackets they hadn't worn in years. No bands, no speeches at first, just the quiet shuffle of those who remembered. The inscription on the statue's base read, "In honor of those who didn't make it home and the one who never forgot them." Elena Dawson was the first to step forward. She wore a simple black dress, a single silver dog tag around her neck, her brother's. She placed a white flower at the statue's foot and turned to the crowd. "I used to think standing down was weakness," she said, voice trembling. "But Colonel Rourke taught me that sometimes standing still is the bravest thing a soldier can do." As she stepped back, General Holston approached with the folded flag Anthony Reyes had given Colton weeks before. She handed it to him now in front of the entire gathering. "This is no longer for the dead," she said softly. "It's for the living who remember them." Colton took it arm steady. But behind his eyes something flickered. Not pride, something closer to ache, to peace. And then came the moment. A hush fell over the field as hundreds of veterans stood as straight as they could. From the Korean War to Afghanistan, from dusty boots to worn sneakers, they formed into quiet ranks. No orders, no prompting, just instinct. Then, as if moved by one heart, they lifted their hands in unison and saluted the man who had reminded a nation what dignity looked like. And across the field, someone else was watching. Vivian Rowe stood at a distance away from the press, away from the front row. She wore civilian clothes now. No robe, no entourage. She had declined to speak, but she came anyway. And when her eyes met Colton's, just for a second, she lowered her head. Some mistakes echo longer than others. After the ceremony, a young boy walked up to Colton. He couldn't have been more than 10. Freckles, buzz cut. The boy held out a notebook with shaking hands. "Sir," he whispered, "my grandpa said you're the kind of man I should learn from. Can you sign this?" Colton took the notebook and smiled gently. "I'll sign it," he said, "but only if you promise to ask your grandpa what it means to keep your word." The boy nodded solemnly, and as Colton signed, the boy leaned in. "Were you scared when they told you to take it off?" Colton paused. "Not scared," he said, "but sad. Sad that I had to explain why I wore it. And that's when you felt it, the lump in your throat, the weight in your chest, the truth behind all of this. Because this story wasn't just about medals or orders or trials. It was about memory, about a generation that has carried the burdens of others in silence for too long. And one man who decided that silence wasn't an option anymore. Later that evening, a candlelight vigil was held beside the statue. Veterans and civilians alike stood side by side, holding names on small placards. Names of friends, of brothers, of wives, of sons. Colton didn't speak again that night. He simply stood beneath the statue and saluted back. If this moment moved you, if it reminded you of someone who never asked for recognition but always deserved it, leave a comment below with the word "still." Because sometimes the quietest salute is the one we never forget. And if you're still watching, ask yourself this: what do we owe those who stood quietly when it was easier to walk away? Because in the end, medals tarnish, voices fade, but honor stays. Would you like me to help you compile the full 5-part story into a single script or create a cinematic voiceover version for narration?